Yes, the power sector is very, very important in Nigeria, and for obvious reasons, and we will not go over that at the moment. And but as your question already said, we need to set some context. So as an economist, you always start with setting some context in terms of the macroeconomy and how that affects the average Nigerian. So I think the best place to start is to start from 2015. Since 2015, we have had a very, very poor macroeconomic numbers. And it started with, obviously, the decline in oil prices, which has, even up to now, has not necessarily recovered up to the levels that we saw in the decade before that. Of course, there are some policy issues, but there's really no point going into that at the moment. So since 2015, we've had some very, very poor macroeconomic numbers. And of course, as you mentioned, there was recession in 2016, and we came out of that recession in 2017. But to really understand how poor those numbers were is to look at it from the average macro GDP growth between that 2015 and 2019. In that period, we did less than 2.5 on average. And that average GDP growth is less than the population growth rate. So what that actually means is that between, when you compare 2015 and 2019, the economy was not only, had not recovered to the point of the size that we had in 2015, but it also means that the average Nigerian was poorer in 2019 compared to 2015. So this is what shapes poverty dynamics in the country. And in fact, if you recall very well, in June 2018, there was a very, very important report released by the Brookings Institution. And in that report, it claimed that Nigeria had 87 million people living in extreme poverty, and that this number was actually rising by 6 people a minute. So if you do your back of the envelope calculation, which I did, it actually meant that by the end of 2019, Nigeria would have added almost 5 million people to those numbers. So before COVID, we're already talking about over 19 million people living in extreme poverty before COVID. And of course, we know that COVID has made matters worse. COVID has made matters worse. The first indication of COVID making the matters worse was the GDP number for Q2 that was released by the National Bureau of Statistics, which showed that the economy declined by 6.1% in Q2. The expectation is that the decline in Q3 may not be as much as that, but if there's any decline in Q3 as well, it means that we actually do have another recession, which will be the second one in 4 years. So these are, as the former minister said one time, that these are technical numbers. However, they have implications for incomes, jobs, investment, and of course, for prosperity and poverty. So when you combine all these things, when you leave the economic technicalities and jargons out of it, you're actually talking about people's lives, people's jobs. So you are having businesses are not only not able to create additional jobs for all the millions of Nigerians entering the job markets, but they are actually shedding jobs as well. So not only are incomes falling, unemployment is falling, unemployment is rising, standard of living is obviously falling, people are becoming poorer, and of course, prices going up. So the pressures, when you put all this together, you have a very, very enormous pressure on the average Nigerian, and the average Nigerian is poor. So that is the context. That is the context in terms of the past. But what do we see forward? The expectation it's not that things will be dramatically different. The expectation is that we will still be in the slow growth territory even come next year. And the reason is very, very simple. If you look at the shape of the global pandemic, whether it's the US or the China or Europe, there is no sense here that the global economy is out of the woods. I mean, there are many countries that are entering the second wave of the pandemic, and this will also have implication for oil demand and, of course, the prices, which Nigeria depend on very, very heavily for his government income, for foreign exchange, and of course, without which, for which we have so much pressure on prices and inflation. So let me leave it at that. That's just setting the context, but that is how bad it is for the macroeconomy. But the effect is really on the individual. So when you talk to the individuals, I mean, poverty is increasing, unemployment is increasing, companies are shedding jobs, some sectors are not doing well at all. So these are lives that we are talking about.
Wow, that paints the picture of what situation we're in. Given that Nigeria, just as a follow-up to this question, that the economy in Nigeria, the average earning principle for most people is based on a cash economy rather than the US system or the UK system that's a bit of a credit economy. What are some of those effects as we talk about all these numbers you just talked through?
Sorry, come again. You said what? I
said, given that the Nigerian economy is cash-based, where most people get paid a labor fee for their work for a day pay, and other economies, other mature economies, are based on a credit system, how has that affected what the average Nigerian is going through given COVID and the looming recession?
Yes, I mean, that's also a very, very important question. And the symbol, or let me say the symptom of that is actually the large, very large informal sector. That's one. Another symbol and symptom is the very, very low level of financial inclusion in Nigeria in terms of bank accounts and access to bank services. So yes, but of course, the greatest symptom is poverty, because let me try and dimension poverty here. For somebody to require banking services, the person should have gone slightly beyond what I call survivor. So if you look at most of the people we are talking about here, you see, they have no money to save at all because they don't even have enough to feed. So when you don't have enough to feed, you do not have need for financial services. And of course, it means that you don't have the need to be integrated into the formal system. So you are just moving from selling your bananas and to buying your apple to go and eat at home, and that is just your life, really. You're just moving in a poverty cycle, the people around you, poverty cycle, and even the kind of conversation in terms of electricity and grid, electricity tariffs and all those kind of things that we are having at the moment, they are not part of that discussion. They are not. Some of them are not even connected to the grid, not to talk of being mindful of any form of tariff increase. So when we are talking about cash economy rather than credit economy, there are different dimensions. I know that there's me and you in terms of no credit, we think, oh, how come at this level I cannot get a mortgage? But those are the top end credit problems for an economy like Nigeria. But when you talk of the very, very basic, credit is the last thing they think about because they cannot even survive. They are not even part of the formal economy where you can even get credit in the first place. So I think we need to separate it too. I mean, they are just far out of what the kind of discussion we are talking about. The poor people we are talking about, they are not part of that discussion. Me and you can talk about credit. If we want to buy our car, we have to look for money to put the cash down, whether it's 6 million or 10 million or 12 million, we have to look for the cash. That is not good for the economy. If we want to buy our houses, we have to save ourselves and buy the properties that we want. Yes, that is also not good. However, I am saying that for the many millions of Nigeria, I think that's where the work needs to really start. They are not even part of this system at all. They are not part of it, no matter how low the barrier is. Even just having an account to even put money, they are not even part of it.
Wow. Okay. So given the time constraints, let's move on to the next question. This is around in 2018, you were a guest on our monthly Power Dialogue. In that session, we discussed the negative economic impact of increased tariffs on cost of goods and services. Have your views evolved since then? What do you see as the impact of the proposed tariff increase on Nigeria's economic prospects?
Okay, thank you for that. Let me dimension the answer in different ways. I think the first thing is to say that the cost of electricity is a major component in the production of goods and services. And let me tell you the three areas of the cost that I believe is general to Nigeria. The first one is the cost to those that actually have access to the grid. So I'm in my office at the moment. I'm not entirely sure whether we are using NEPA at the moment or we are using our diesel. But let's assume we are using NEPA. I mean, we are using electricity from the grid at the moment. So the cost to me, that is one area of cost. So in terms of cost. The second dimension of electricity cost in Nigeria is that when you do not have access to the power from the grid, that's from the system, how do you support your production or your consumption or your standard of living, or at least the use of power? And then that is either you use diesel generator, you use a gas power generator, or you use fuel generator. So that's what we use to support it. Now, but there's the third aspect of cost. There's a third dimension of cost that many people don't think of. And when most Nigeria argue in terms of electricity, this is the one that they don't usually consider. There is the opportunity cost. That means if you do not actually have the power, if you do not have, what does it actually cost you? And let me tell you the example I usually give at this stage, at this point. For me and you, our children, when they go to school, they actually have access to electricity. The school have electricity, but there are, and they can afford to study maybe 8 p.m., 9 p.m., or even 10 p.m. because their parents can afford diesel or whatever it is. But there are many families all around the country that their standard of living, their growth is in a way stunted because of the lack of access to electricity. You know, the opportunity cost of that is almost unquantifiable. You cannot even quantify that because it means that there's so much uncertainty around their future. So that's the dimension of cost. So that's number one. Now let's now talk about the tariff, which is the question that you asked. From the consumer point of view, it means an immediate increase in the cost of living. That's what it means. And also for businesses, it means an immediate increase in the cost of production, whether they are producing goods or they're producing services like I do. Now, that is that for businesses and consumers. But let's now talk from a national policy point of view. In the past, especially since there have been improvements, improvements around the power sector reform and that kind of thing. What are we trying to do? What we are trying to do is what you said in your introduction. We're trying to get to the point where the system takes care of itself. That's, oh, the discourse, they sell to the consumer pay, the disco pays to Genco collects gas. I mean, there's a whole loads of value chain. But that value chain all depend on the resources and the ability of the disco to actually collect monies for the services provided. So that is from the national policy point of view. So that policy area or that system is not working.
Mm-hmm.
The system is not working, and the evidence that it's not working is that between 2016 and 2019, the Nigerian government spent in the region of $4 billion on subsidy because there is so much under recovery. So why does the subsidy not work? Why does this arrangement not work? One, is because the structure is weak. And of course, there is corruption in the system. And this is the one that is even important, this third one. It is that there are leakages in the market aspect of the industry. So when you take all this into consideration, it is very important that we have a proper governance system. And of course, we have the right tariffs. Because if we do not have the right tariffs, the lack of investment we have seen in the last 5 years is what we will continue to see. And if we don't see the investment, we will not be able to improve on the production of electricity. If we don't improve on the production of electricity, we will not be able to scale up in order for the unit prices of this electricity to fall. And of course, if we don't scale up and provide electricity to Nigerians, the opportunity cost of electricity or the absence of electricity will continue to increase, and it means greater level of poverty in the future.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. Most people never identify the opportunity cost of it because people look at the cost based on the cost for diesel or the cost for the distribution company. But also, I think to go further to your point, if folks actually did the math on what the cost of the opportunity cost would be, there would be a rethink on how they value the business, how they value what they use. But I think if we look at what NERC is trying to do with this service-based tariff, which classifies customers into 5 categories based on varying levels of agreed power supply. The categories, as you know, are based on a band A through a band E, which decreasing power supply from band A all the way to band E. What's your view on this approach, and how will it affect the economic power of the average Nigerian?
Okay, I think the way to understand this is to come from the view of why did the government think they needed this approach? And the reason that I could come up with is because of credibility.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk to consumers, especially when I talk to them, there's usually this, the notion that why should I pay since I don't have light? Then I usually ask, do you have light at all? They say, yes, I have light, but I mean, most of the time there's no light. I said, okay, but the period that you have light for, you need to pay for that period. Oh, they say, no, because I mean, I don't have light. I still spend so much money on the second dimension of the cost I talked about. I spend so much money on diesel. I spend so much money on fuel. So why should I pay them? Because I really don't have the light. Now, so they felt that if you are increasing the tariff, they felt if they were increasing the tariff, then they needed to say, look, okay, we know that you don't have light for 24 hours a day. However, we promise you that you will have 8 hours a day. And so they are trying to remove the uncertainty and the unpredictability about power. And the consumer can then gauge or at least assess the kind of cost, both the first dimension, which is from electricity from the grid, and the second dimension, from diesel. And hopefully that credibility problem, there will be, I mean, at least they can have a sense of credibility. However, I don't have a problem with that because, like I said, it's a credibility issue. When you have a credibility crisis, you just have to solve it whichever way you can. But the issue is that we have to find the confidence to tell Nigerians that, look, there is the immediate problem we are trying to solve. And of course, there's the long-term problem we are trying to solve. So until we can convince them that, look, if we don't solve the immediate problem of you paying for the power, whether it's 2 hours or 3 hours that you get, we will not be able to make the investment to provide the 12, 14, 24 hours power supply that eventually will reduce your cost of the cost of providing power to you, maybe in 5 years' time or in 7 years' time. We have been on this journey for a while now. I mean, this journey did not start with privatization. It started with NEPA itself.
Mm-hmm.
It started with NEPA. Yes, NEPA was corrupt. However, there was no tangible investment for 20 years. So if we are not able to focus and implement these tariff increases, there will also be no investment in the next 10 years. And we will continue to burn serious money on diesel.
Mm.
And the opportunity cost of power will continue to increase. Because the point we want to get to is not just for the point for me and you, because we can afford it, to pay excessively for power, is to ensure that we can scale up to the extent that everyone in Nigeria can pay for the power that they have access to. And that is when they can improve their standard of living. That is when they are able to improve their income and productivities. And of course, that is when we'll be able to increase the capacity to provide jobs in this country. Until we do that, we'll just be dancing around circles. So I am in support of tariff increases, even though it means short-term pain for businesses and for consumers. But if we don't do that now, there's never a good time to do reforms.
No, that's a really good point about the time to do it. We've danced around this issue for the past 3-4 years now, with the promise to distribution companies, oh, we will increase tariffs to make it cost reflective, but that hasn't happened. This approach, I believe, should be that pathway. But just let me follow up quickly on this question around why does the average Nigerian still view power as a right rather than something of a private entity? You don't see people not paying. This comparison probably doesn't quite hold up, but it's relative in terms of the communication sector. You don't see people not paying for their cell phone bills. You see people paying those and paying it gladly because they know if they don't pay, they can't use the service. So why do Nigerians view that the power sector is not that rigid, and a lot of people are not willing to pay what the cost of electricity is?
Well, I think you have to blame the government. And I mean this with all sense of responsibility. And when I mean the government, I don't mean this administration. I mean government, because this is an historical problem. You know, when we talk of governance in this country, there are so many notions about it, but let me try and remember one or two, or let me mention one or two. From my view, I think the first is that there's this notion that the government should provide it. Whether we like it or not, that notion has been with us for a while. So there's this notion that the government should provide it. And the problem is that when the government does not now provide it, we individuals, including those in government, they look for a way around it to meet their own personal need. So we need to go back 20, 30 years to look at the root of the problem that we are now trying to solve. For instance, how many Nigerians have access to water? I mean, to water, to what we call pipe bomb water. Let me use the basic word. How many Nigerians? Very, very few. However, the same group of Nigerians spend an average of between 600 and 1 million to sink boreholes. To sink boreholes. So, how many people are paying for electricity? The same group of Nigerians, the middle class and the rich, the elite that are supposed to be in charge of this governance and make the convincing argument to the rest of Nigerians. The need for us to run our country differently. They would rather go and buy diesel generators and buy massive sizes of generator and have lights 24 hours in their homes, either because they are in government or they run big organizations. The point I'm trying to make is this. We can either, as a country, continue to say, look, what is the system that works for everyone? Or we can choose as a country and say, okay, because we don't want to make the argument for all, we look for a roundabout system to satisfy our own personal need. So whether it is water, it's the same argument. If you look at power, the same argument. If you look at education, that is what gave rise to the scale of private sector education that we have today in Nigeria. Because we feel that we do not want to solve the problem for all. So we look for a private solution for ourselves. But there is no country in the world where that works and they are able to eradicate poverty and they are able to grow in the kind of numbers that they need to grow in order to do that. So for me, whether it's power, water, education, healthcare, we have to look for a solution, an optimal solution. And there are economic solutions to all this that ensure that, the money that the country spends in total gives the country the best. But at the moment, we spend so much on diesel, we spend so much on fuel, we spend so much on private education, we spend so much on borehole, we spend so much on everything for private, but however, we are not getting the optimal solution.
Thank you for that. So you've made some very good points. And one point I would want to pick up on or address further is the regulational aspect of it. Looking at the fact that you run a newspaper, so and you've seen all the different things that have come through from distribution companies doing this, transmission companies doing this, generating companies doing this, and some of these things are against the market rules or against how they should be, how they should operate. What's your view as far as when does the government step in to assist the regulator in doing their role? Because it seems that a lot of these things could be squashed if we follow the market rules from what they're supposed to be. How, more or less, my question is, how do we ensure that we have government oversight to make sure that these market participants are actually following the rules that are laid out based on the Act from 2005? Okay,
thank you, Emeka. I'm just going to start again from where I stopped. The problem is, the word I will use is what is appropriate. And what do I mean by that is that in some cases, the governance structure that we need or that will work is less of government. In some cases, it is more that we need in some cases. So for every, like in this case now, what we need to think of is what is appropriate level of involvement that is required. That's what we need to find out. For instance, I believe that the reason that the power sector, there are so many reasons why so far it appears that the power sector reform is not working. One is that the government has intervened when it was not supposed to intervene, in most cases by breaking its own rules. For instance, we have a MITO. Okay, but the MITO was not made to work. The government intervened and said, the poor should not do this or whatever it is. They now said, okay, we will pay subsidy. And it came to a point where the discourse and even those in the sector said, okay, if the government is going to be giving us money every month, then what is the point of investing in the collection of the service that we have delivered? So what I'm trying to say here is that it is not necessarily about more or less. It is, look, can we just sit down and say, this is what is appropriate? This is what we will do in the next 5 years, and stick to the rules, stick to the policy, and ensure that this is what will work. Because if we don't do that, this is 2020. Okay, for instance, they increased the tariffs. The labor people went and said, oh, why was the tariff increased, right? Mm-hmm. The government came all of a sudden and suspended it for 2 weeks. So what is going to happen when the 2 weeks end?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Has anybody bothered to find out what is going to happen? Are we going to go back? So what I'm trying to say is that there is so much uncertainty and unpredictability in the system. And when you have such an environment, there is nobody that will invest. And without the necessary investment, we will not get the increment in the productive capacity. If we are not able to improve the capacity, we will not get a decline in the unit price of providing electricity. If we don't get that, the opportunity cost of that power will continue, of the absence of power will continue to increase. And I don't know at what point does the system break and cannot be repaired anymore. So for me, let the government say, look, this is what is appropriate. Make the argument, convince Nigerians that this is what is good for us. And this is the way we want to go. There is no going back. You can't be going back 2 weeks, 1 month. I mean, for instance, let me give you an example for something that is slightly related, but not on this matter. On the fuel subsidy, for instance, the government has removed the fuel subsidy, but I know that they have removed this fuel subsidy, but there is no guarantee that they will not go back, because just within a month, they have gone back on power. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. They have gone back. So how do you run a nation like this?
No, and that's the issue, because there's always this conversation around protecting the poor, that there's a lot of Nigerians that are suffering, which is why it took so long for the arguments for VAT to happen, and that's still going on because they feel that the poor are still being affected. And now this new directive that we saw a few, I guess that was last week, when they rolled back the plans for the electricity tariff. The distribution companies have really looked at this, and it's probably very difficult to do business in that space, because for being a service-based tariff, you're now having incentive to bring the transformer, the substation, the wires to areas where there's a pipeline for you to do well financially, because you're running this as a business. You're trying to make money. You're trying to make profit. That's really the essence of this. So it's very confusing as a business person in this space. But I think one issue that keeps recurring is the poverty angle. How do we really talk about it? And one of the ways the government has tried to address this challenge is to exclude the two bottom categories, that's category D and E, from the proposed tariff increase. Is this the right way to do it? How else can the government aid the over 100 million Nigerians and counting that are struggling, who make less than the $2 a day? What else can the government do to aid those people?
Thank you for that question. I think there are many dimensions of this question, but I think the first one is identity. We know they are there, but do we know them?
Okay.
I mean, do we know these people? Do we know where they are? Do we know where they live? Do we know what they do? So there is a great level of identity problems that we need to probably solve in the first place. So when we overcome the identity problems, then it is easy to make targeted subsidy. And let me say this: I am not against total subsidy. All over the world, there are subsidies, but there are subsidies that that stifles production capacity. So it's all about production. But if your subsidy is, rather than helping the country improve its productive capacity, is actually stifling the growth of that productive capacity, then that subsidy is not working. And it is, you can tell for fuel subsidy is not working because we are not able to get that investment because of that. For power is not working. Agriculture, I agree for subsidy in principle, but the system is not working. Also, it's not working very well because of identity problems. So what I'm trying to say is that let's know what you want to subsidize. Let's know what we should not subsidize. For me, I don't see any reason why we should subsidize power and we should subsidize electricity. Let me tell you this. Let me give you an example. When the first time I arrived the UK, when I went to do my master's in 1995, I stayed in my family house in London. And every night I have to be reminded to switch off the light. Every night I have to be reminded, every night. But when I started paying for electricity myself, all of a sudden, nobody reminded me to switch off electricity, to switch off light. I mean, that is what economic incentives do to you. So at the moment, by the time the tariff actually went up, go and ask even middle income and upper income homes. They started switching off their lights because their electricity bill went up. You know, but at the moment we leave light even when we don't need it. We just put on the AC in the other room. We put on the air conditioner in the other room. We leave the in the kitchen. So why? Because the electricity tariff is not cost reserved, because it is subsidized. So it is not a key component of our expenditure. But no matter how rich you are in the US or in the UK, you won't try that. You won't leave light on where you don't need it.
No.
So if you're going to subsidize the poor, I do not have a problem subsidizing the poor, but he has to be targeted. And for it to be targeted, you have to solve the identity problems. I don't think we have overcome the identity problems, and I think that's why we have serious problem targeting subsidies in Nigeria.
Okay, and that's a really, really good point around how subsidies work. And given there was a bit of pushback between National Assembly around giving Nigeria's free power during COVID-19, that first initial wave, the conversation there really boiled down to, we want to give Nigerians free power, but the sector experts were saying, how will this be financed? What would you do? Who will pay for it? Because this is not free. So I'm of the opinion that some of these subsidies that the government is doling out in different areas like power or petroleum could be used in other areas to build up the economy. Is that the same viewpoint you have?
No, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I mean, if you're spending over $1 trillion on fuel subsidy, and you have, I mean, who are you subsidizing really? Well, I'm not going to say that the poor don't benefit at all. The poor, in some sense, maybe have some benefit, but the greatest beneficiaries are two groups of people: the middle class and upper income people, and of course the government. You know, I am not under any illusion. I am not under any illusion that when the poor is benefiting 2,000 naira over a 2-month period because of fuel subsidy. There is someone somewhere in government that is just smiling home every day. I mean, seriously laughing and smiling home. I'm sure you know what I mean. I mean, laughing and smiling home because he or she is promoting subsidy. So the leakages in the system does not compensate and is not worth the benefits that the poor receive. That's one. Then what are the opportunity costs? In economics, you have to always look at the opportunity cost. What is the level of investment in education? What is the level of investment on roads? What is the level of investment on rails? My office is in Apapa. As I'm talking to you, I'm sitting somewhere in Apapa. And I only need to look across and see the shambolic, disastrous, and the calamity of a failure of a nation. When you have over 2,000-3,000 trailers just around you because we cannot solve a simple problem of how we should move our goods from ports. So I would rather you take 2 years subsidy and solve a Papa problem. So that is the opportunity cost. So whatever amount of money, the financial cost is what we talk about, but the opportunity cost is huge, it's tremendous. Because when you are not focusing on the right policy, the appropriate policy, you are focusing on policies that don't work because the people that are promoting such policies, they have their own private interest, and you cannot deny that.
Yeah. Okay. No, I agree to that extent. The whole Apapa dynamics and the whole rail sector for me is one of those areas where we have to get it right. Infrastructure is a massive issue in the country, both power, both roads, both rail, and it just hasn't happened. And not this government, but all governments in general in Nigeria have failed to get this done. Some have done better than others, but we really have to refocus to be able to make this country work, because as you're saying, if you're bringing goods in, there's no real pipeline, there's no real way you can guarantee that you'll get it on this day, as opposed to everywhere in the world is guaranteed what you're going to get when you send things through. So I have a final question, but to the audience, please, as we said in the chat, post your questions and we will get to those. We have about 11 minutes left, so we've got to get through this and a couple of questions from the audience that have already come in. But Dr. Okiti, how does this tariff issue really address the current challenges in the sector? The market's been illiquid here for the past, since 2013, and there's now a deficit of close to 2 trillion naira. Is this tariff methodology the silver bullet that will fix the sector, or will this be one of other interventions that are needed in order to get us on the right path?
Okay, I do not think the tariff problem is the only problem. So in that case, it's not a silver bullet. However, if you solve all other problems without resolving the tariff problem, you will go nowhere. Okay. So the context is this: the tariff problem is very, very important and critical. So if we solve the tariff problem now, that is a very huge step and huge progress towards improving the capacity in the industry and ensuring that many more millions of Nigerians have access to electricity. So, because the tariff does 2 important things. Let me say. The first thing it does is that when you have a tariff system and you have a complete recovery, at least of the services provided, then it starts to give investors the confidence that if they borrow money from international banks and local banks or from international institutions, then there is a pathway for them to not only recovering their investment, but also making profit. So that is very, very important to improving the productivity capacity in the sector. But the second thing, which is also very, very important, is that it now gives the allowance and the time for everyone to believe that there is now a system that works. Mm-hmm. Because the problem now is that the system does not work. You don't know what side of the bed the government will wake up tomorrow, like they did just a few days ago, and say, oh, we suspend this for 2 weeks. They just keep suspending. They keep introducing. They keep changing. So there is no way as an investor or as a participant in the sector, I will just sit down and be watching and say, okay, whenever it is that becomes predictable, then we will do something for the long term, 5 years, 10 years. Because power is not just like producing, it's not just like cooking rice to sell in the market tomorrow. It is a multi-billion investment, industry. So if you are making investment, you are making investment in millions of US dollars. So it's not, you can't just make investment on the basis of what the government said in 2 weeks, 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago. You have to wait. So the tariff is necessary for us to start that process. If there are no changes to the tariff, all the other issues around governance, the other issues around intervention, the other issues around, I mean, there are so many other issues they will not have. So the tariff is the first start. We need to get it right. We need to be consistent about it, ensure that the discourse get their service, they get service reflective tariff, move on to cost reflective tariff. And within the next 2-3 years, when there is stability of that process, then you'll begin to see the kind of investment that we had hoped to see when the sector was privatized.
Thank you for that. So if I'm hearing you correctly, this approach of tariff is like almost it's not the silver bullet, but it's the first step to a very long stairwell of issues that need to be addressed. But if you don't address this first step, nothing else you do will be profitable or will be sustainable. Okay, good. So we have a few questions that have come in. May I ask the folks behind the scenes to unmute Abby? She has a question. Over to you, Abby. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to connect and hear Dr. Okiti talk. Dr. Okiti, this is Abby Jagu. You've spoken a lot around the sequencing of initiatives and recommendations that are required for us to really see progress in the delivery of electricity. And, thank you for outlining some of those. Most of your interventions have really been on the supply side, and rightly so, because of the amount of work that needs to be done. But I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the demand side. When you have talked about demand side factors that can catalyze market growth, it has been about the behaviors you want users of electricity to adopt. But, it really depends on trust. And I wonder if you could talk about the behaviors that engender trust, specifically having clear pathways for redress and complaints. I noted earlier you mentioned telecommunications and how people pay their telecommunications bills. But, consumers know that if they have a problem, there are ways in which they can complain and their voice will be heard, and also ways in which they can get redress. And we're also beginning to see that in banking. And so as service providers are held accountable for the quality of service they provide, you would find that consumers themselves, would act appropriately when it comes to paying their bills, utility. And I guess that's just something I don't hear enough when we're talking about power reform. Over.
Yes, Dr. Jack, good to hear from you. And I mean, you're right. The truth of the matter is that across sectors, Nigerians as a whole, I think we have a lot to learn in terms of customer service delivery. And the question is even important. I mean, this is customer week, customer service week. There's a lot to learn. However, I think the reason we focus so much on the supply side, as you said, is because there's just so much problem that if you don't solve the big problems, then it's just so difficult to start solving the small problems. So the big problems are facing us. The big problem is that we don't have light. The big problem is that we use so much of diesel. There is noise pollution. There's too much of, there is risk. There are injuries. I mean, those are just too many problems that if we address the supply side, then we can begin to look at this other issue. But I totally agree with you. Whether it's the banking, whether it's insurance, whether it's power, whether it's fuel, there's this notion that we just think we are doing people a favor when we sell things or when they require services from even supermarkets. Of course, over time, I believe we will improve, but I totally agree with you. We need to do so much in terms of service delivery. For instance, you have prepaid meters. There is not enough commitment to ensuring that most Nigerians have prepaid meters and ensure that their billing is right. Not much of it. So those are things that we need to work on. However, when you have the big problems staring you in the face, you have to deal with those one first. But I agree with your sentiment, and I agree that we should do so much about that. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Abby. I think that was a really good question. Looking at the demand and the supply side, it's something that we always focus on supply. So that was a really good point. We have literally a minute left, and we have another question that has come through. Given that we like to start and end things on time, we will not be able to take that question. So let me throw it back to you, Dr. Okiti, to go ahead and give us a closing remark and spend a minute doing it so we can end right at 5 o'clock. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Let me close this remark with a thought that I've had for a while, and it's very important to this discussion, and in fact to discussions around so many of our problems. Is when economists talk about economies of scale. There are benefits of economies of scale. So for instance, if you drive a very solid SUV, say in Lagos, for instance, there are chances that you are going to pay very, very heavily in terms of insurance. So if you look at the power industry today, we all pay over the odds for power when we combine those three costs I just told you. So the first two is the middle class and the rich that pay those costs. But the third one, which is the opportunity cost, is actually the poor. However, what every country, what people that have got it right, what they have done, and the people that are still trying to get it, what they are doing is that they're looking for an optimal solution for everyone. And in that optimal solution is what you call economies of scale. So how do we supply electricity to most Nigerians and then pay, everybody now pays a fraction of it? Because at the moment I am paying so much, but it's because I need it so much and I can afford it. But really, if I have electricity from the grid 24 hours, I will not be paying as much as I do now. Then the money, the resources that I save, I can use it for other things. Most likely maybe investment. And that way, the country will also benefit from my investment. So what I'm trying to say is that let's develop a system that works for everyone. And that is when the country will begin to benefit from the savings. And I'm talking collective savings, not individual savings. The collective savings that we will make on power, on fuel, on education, on healthcare, So we need to think of how economies of scale work, so that we can solve our problem using the principles of it. That will be my conclusion.
Thank you, sir. And as a fellow economist, I definitely agree. And I think that's really where we've gotten it wrong. Just to summarize, it looks like your point of view is the service-based tariff is a first step. And there's a few more things that have to happen. But unless we have the oil, which is the money that's flowing through the entire chain, this bus is going nowhere, just to use an expression. And I believe that most folks in the sector have the same feeling, but also this is how it's worked in other countries, and this is how they solve their power sector issues. So Nigeria shouldn't be different and can't be different. We have to be disciplined and collaborative, and we have to coordinate them all throughout the value chain in order for us to move forward. Thank you for your time, sir. This has been very useful, and I'm sure the audience found it quite insightful. Thank you, and have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Emeka. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Right, have a good one. Bye-bye.